I hope you hear her cries as you try to sleep at night. I hope you see the tears run down her face when she asked you to go home. I hope you spend the rest of your life in fear of death. You will never hurt another child again. Judge Howard, speaking for myself, for my community, and the nation, I plead with you to accept the recommendation of the jury for death as presented to you by the jury 10 to 2, and a vote of 12 for 4 guilty verdicts, and to remember the words of a wise old black man in Terravis. It's just too heavy, Your Honor. It's too heavy for mercy.
On a quiet, peaceful night in February 2005, the small town of Homosassa, Florida, was turned upside down. As the world slept, 9-year-old Jessica Lunsford was taken from her home in the dead of night. The house was quiet, the streets empty, and no one could have imagined that within hours, the safety of their community would be shattered forever. Jessica's family had no idea. They had no warning, no sign that anything was wrong, until they woke up and found her gone. Her absence was a puzzle, a nightmare no one could solve. A simple phone call was all it took to pull the whole town into a terrifying mystery. But what made this crime even more horrifying was the man responsible for it. John Evander Cooey, her abductor, was a convicted sex offender. He had a history of crimes, yet somehow, he was free. Free to live just yards away from Jessica's home, free to walk the streets, free to do the unthinkable. As days passed, the search for Jessica grew more desperate. People prayed for a miracle, but the truth was darker than anyone could have imagined. The horror that followed would shake the community to its core and leave a nation grappling with the unthinkable. And as the investigation unfolded, the reality began to set in. The monster who had stolen Jessica's life was someone who should have never been allowed to walk free. How well do you know the people living closest to your home? I want to hear from you. Thank you for joining me on today's case. Let me know where you are watching from, and please share your thoughts in the comment section. If this is your first time here, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new story. Let's walk through exactly what happened that day, step by step. Stay with me until the end. Every detail matters. February 24th, 2005, began like any other Thursday in Homosassa, Florida. The air was cool. The sun hadn't yet stretched across the trees. In the Lunsford home, the house was still. No alarms. No signs of panic. Just another quiet morning. Jessica's father, Mark, was getting ready for work. Her grandparents were moving about the house as usual. Jessica's room was just off the main hallway, a small space filled with stuffed animals, colorful posters, and little handwritten notes she had taped to the wall. Her Bible sat on her nightstand, next to a pink flashlight she kept in case she ever got scared at night. By all appearances, nothing was out of place. But something was terribly wrong. Jessica wasn't in her bed. Her blanket was pushed to the side. Her favorite dolphin pillow was on the floor. The back door was closed but unlocked, something Mark rarely allowed. At first, it didn't seem real. Maybe she was in the bathroom. Maybe she had walked out to see her grandma. Maybe she had just woken up early. They checked every room. They called her name. They searched the yard. No answer. No footsteps. No sign of where she went. 9-year-old Jessica Lunsford was gone. She wasn't the kind of child who wandered off. She didn't sneak out. She was careful, shy even. Always stayed close to home. Always told her dad where she was going. Jessica was gentle by nature. Her heart was soft, even at her age. She loved animals more than anything. She wanted to be a veterinarian when she grew up. She said she wanted to help the ones who couldn't speak for themselves. She carried that kindness everywhere she went. She adored her dad. Mark raised her on his own, and their bond was strong. He called her his baby girl, and she clung to him like her world depended on it. To her, it probably did. Now, her room sat silent. Her backpack untouched. Her shoes still by the door. The clothes she was supposed to wear that day hung neatly in her closet, never to be worn. Word spread fast. By the time the morning news played on local TV, neighbors were already outside. People knocked on doors, checked ditches, walked the woods. Volunteers showed up in jeans and work boots, flashlights in hand, calling out her name. Jessica's face was printed on flyers within hours. Photos of her in bright clothes, with her crooked smile and missing tooth, passed from hand to hand across the county. Her story reached across the state lines within days. No one could believe a little girl had disappeared from her bed without a single scream. No forced entry, no clear motive, no answers. Yet as the town searched and her family prayed, the man who took her was watching it all unfold from just across the street. He wasn't a stranger to the law. He wasn't new to this neighborhood. He had been there long enough to learn her routine, long enough to plan. Jessica had been taken while the people who loved her were just steps away, and she hadn't been taken far. This nightmare was only just beginning. What would you do if you found out that someone who had already hurt others was living right near you? Share your thoughts in the comment section. The morning Jessica vanished, deputies arrived quickly. Helicopters circled the area. Bloodhounds were brought in. Volunteers moved through the woods with sticks, peeking into old sheds and ditches. From the outside, it looked like everything was being done, but something critical was missed. Less than 70 yards from Jessica's front door stood a small, weather-worn trailer. It was easy to miss, hidden behind another house. No curtains in the window, the kind of place no one paid attention to. Inside that trailer lived a man named John Cooey. He had no job, no family around, just a mattress on the floor and a small TV that barely worked. But what stood out most was his record. Cooey was a 46-year-old registered sex offender. His rap sheet dated back to the 1970s. He had been arrested for burglary, assault, and repeatedly sexual offenses against children. He had violated parole, skipped supervision, and every time, somehow, he slipped through the cracks. He was never supposed to live near children, not even supposed to be in Citrus County. Yet he was right there, less than a minute's walk from Jessica's window, and no one was watching him. The sheriff's office had gone door to door that first day, asked questions, took statements. But when they knocked on Cooey's door, he wasn't there. A woman who lived with him, his half-sister, answered instead. Said he wasn't home. Said she hadn't seen Jessica either. The deputy took her word and moved on. That one decision would come back like a thunderclap. Days passed. Flyers turned to posters. News reports played on every station. Jessica's father went on TV, begging anyone who knew anything to speak up. He couldn't sleep. He couldn't eat. His little girl, his whole world, was gone, and no one had answers. The investigation stalled. Tips poured in from across the country. Psychics called with visions. Neighbors reported cars they didn't recognize. Some people said they saw Jessica at a gas station. Others claimed she had been kidnapped by strangers in a van. None of it was true. All the while, John Cooey kept quiet. He smoked his cigarettes, listened to the radio, and pretended to be just another man in the background. But the truth couldn't stay hidden forever. 3 weeks after Jessica vanished, a break came from somewhere no one expected, a lie told by one of Cooey's own relatives. His half-sister had given a false statement. She had told the deputy Cooey wasn't home the morning Jessica disappeared. But that wasn't true. He had been home, in that trailer. And worse, Jessica had been there too. The moment that lie unraveled, detectives returned with new eyes. They obtained a search warrant, and what they found inside the trailer shattered everything. The place reeked of filth, trash on the floor, rotten food in the sink, a disgusting mattress in the corner with a stained blanket. Hidden under that blanket, between the creases, they found something no one expected: Jessica's fingerprint. That one print changed the entire investigation. The manhunt for Cooey exploded. He had slipped out of Florida, but now he was a wanted fugitive, a predator on the run, and the world was watching. When they finally caught up with him, several states away, he looked tired, dirty, and almost relieved. Brought into custody, surrounded by silence. John Cooey didn't deny what he had done. He confessed. But what he said next turned the case into a national nightmare. Do you think people should be informed when a convicted sex offender moves nearby? I want to hear from you. But hold on, there's a twist somewhere. John Cooey was arrested, but not for Jessica's disappearance. He had been picked up on an unrelated charge. It wasn't anything serious, just an old warrant for a minor offense. But this was the break the investigation had been waiting for. In the chaos that followed his arrest, authorities decided to search his home, a place that had previously been overlooked. And that's when the true horror started to come into focus. I need you to follow me closely. Remember that Cooey's trailer was filthy. It was the kind of place that made you want to gag just walking inside. The walls were stained, the air thick with a musty smell, and trash was scattered across the floor like a toxic layer of neglect. Yet, it was something on the mattress that caught the officer's attention, a bloodstain, fresh and unmistakable. It was like a punch to the gut. The officers knew it was important. They had to investigate further. Inside the mattress was something even more serious, a stain that didn't belong. Something told them this was connected to Jessica. It couldn't just be coincidence. The team quickly obtained a warrant to dig deeper. When the mattress was removed, the room was combed with forensic precision, and every corner of that trailer was searched. Underneath that mattress, hidden in plain sight, investigators found Jessica's personal belongings. Items that were unmistakably hers: clothing, a bracelet, a stuffed animal she'd been known to carry around with her. They weren't just his things. They were hers. The sickening truth started to unfurl. This man had not just been in the area when Jessica went missing. He had taken her. She had been inside his home. The walls of the investigation began to close in on Cooey. The arrest wasn't just a minor charge anymore. The police had found something. And now, they knew they had the key to solving the case. But the real tragedy came when the authorities went back to the woman who had once told them Cooey was innocent, his half-sister. The woman who had lied about not seeing Jessica. They dug deeper into her story and learned something that made their stomachs churn. She had known about Jessica. She had seen Cooey with the girl. And worse, she had allowed him to do it. The woman's confession made the air feel thick. She knew too much, and it was clear now that everyone in the trailer had been involved in hiding the truth. Yet, as much as they knew, it wasn't enough. The most horrifying piece of the puzzle still hadn't been uncovered: the full details of what had happened to Jessica during the days she'd been held captive. And the town was holding its breath, waiting for those details to emerge. But Cooey wasn't talking. The man, now in custody, refused to say anything. The more they pushed, the quieter he became. And then came the waiting. The long, painful wait for a confession. The longer they waited, the more deafening the silence became. And then, after weeks of silence, John Cooey finally spoke. It wasn't a clear, cold confession. It wasn't a grand reveal. It was a whisper of a man whose twisted mind had cracked under the weight of his actions. His words would echo for years, haunting anyone who heard them. Cooey confessed without hesitation, as if there was no remorse. "I saw her, and I just took her." His words were casual, almost offhand, as if he were talking about something ordinary. But there was nothing ordinary about what he had done. "I didn't know what I was doing. I couldn't stop." Just like that, the veil was lifted. The twisted, horrific truth of Jessica's final moments was out in the open. He had acted on impulse. He hadn't planned it. At least, that's how he made it sound. But the fear that set in with those words was palpable. Was it true? Did he really not know what he was doing? Or was this just another way for him to avoid taking full responsibility for his actions? Cooey had been living in that trailer, a short walk from the Lunsford home, for months, yet no one had taken the time to really question him. Not until it was too late. It was almost as though the authorities had been blind to the danger right under their noses. Cooey was a man with no conscience, a man whose life had been a trail of darkness, leading up to this one devastating act. The confession was mind-blowing. Cooey didn't even seem to care that his words were now the final thread linking him to Jessica's horrific fate. His demeanor remained disturbingly calm. He didn't seem to feel the weight of what he had done, or if he did, it was buried under layers of denial and rationalization. I just took her. Those simple words were enough to rip the heart out of anyone who heard them. He had watched her play, watched her laugh and run around her yard. And when he saw the chance, he took it. What happened next was too traumatic to put into words, but the truth began to leak out, piece by piece. Jessica had been taken into the darkness of that trailer, and once inside, she had fought. She had fought with everything she had. But in the end, she was helpless against him. After all, Cooey had been the one with all the power, the one who controlled the situation. He had a history of violence. He had a history of manipulation. And now, he had a victim. But just as the pieces of the investigation were beginning to come together, there was still one more question hanging in the air. Why? Why had John Cooey, after everything he had done in the past, acted on this impulse? Had he been driven by something deeper than just a fleeting moment of desire? Or had his past crimes, his neglect, and the failures of the system left him so broken that he saw no other choice but to take a child from her family? The confession did little to answer those questions. It only opened up more questions, more suspicions. The search that had begun with so much hope and desperation came to an end on March 19, 2005. But it wasn't the resolution that anyone had imagined. The nightmare was far from over. But the truth would come in a way that no one could have prepared for. The search had taken them to a place they hadn't expected. John Cooey's own backyard. The pattern of events, of searches, of hope slowly giving way to despair, all led to one final, haunting moment. A simple discovery. One of the investigators stumbled across something buried in the dirt, something that didn't belong. A shallow grave. And there, in that dark, hidden corner of Cooey's property, was Jessica's lifeless body. Her body was found buried in a hole barely 2.5 feet deep. It was as if her killer had thought he could bury the truth so easily. But the earth could not hold the memory of Jessica's innocence, nor the terror of what she had endured. The grave was crude. The earth had been hastily disturbed, and yet it could not erase the mark she had left on the world. The most devastating detail wasn't just the sight of her tiny, fragile form. It was what came next, the skeletal fingers, barely visible beneath the garbage bags that had been thrown on top of her. Her fingers, poking out through the plastic, were the last trace of life that she had been able to cling to. It was clear Jessica had tried to escape. The thought of her desperate struggle, her fight to get free, to somehow reach safety, sends shivers down your spine. In her final moments, she wasn't just a victim. She was a warrior. She had clawed at the earth, trying to break free from the grasp of the man who had taken her. But in the end, she had been buried alive. The grave became her prison. And then came the coroner's report. The truth was worse than anyone could have imagined. The coroner's findings revealed something that twisted the knife deeper into the hearts of everyone who had hoped for a different outcome. Jessica hadn't died from injury or trauma. She had suffocated to death. The report stated that within minutes of being buried in that shallow grave, she had run out of air. The terror she had felt in those final seconds was unimaginable. The suffocating darkness, the crushing weight of the earth, the overwhelming fear that there was no escape, those were the last things she experienced before her tiny heart stopped beating. Her life, full of potential and dreams, had been stolen from her in the most brutal and heartless way. Her final moments weren't filled with peace, but with the raw terror of a young girl realizing that there was no way out. The people who had known Jessica, her father, her friends, the teachers who had watched her grow, they would never forget her fight. Her life had been stolen, but those last moments would never be erased from their memories. Her final act, her last breath, would haunt them forever. And it was clear that the man who had taken it all, John Cooey, was responsible for more than just the death of a young girl. He was responsible for taking away a future. The discovery of Jessica's body wasn't just the end of the search. It was the beginning of a new nightmare. A nightmare that would fuel the fury and heartbreak of a community that had already suffered too much. The legal battle that followed Jessica's tragic death would test the very fabric of justice. John Cooey, the man responsible for stealing her life, was now in the hands of the law. But the road to his conviction wasn't easy. It would be a fight that involved twists, legal battles, and shocking developments. Cooey's trial became the focal point of the nation's grief. For the community, it felt like the final chance to make sense of the nightmare that had unfolded in their town. But justice was not as clear-cut as everyone had hoped. The biggest twist came early. Despite Cooey's confession, his statement to the police was ruled inadmissible by a judge. It seemed impossible. How could a confession from the very person responsible for the crime be thrown out? Yet, the judge's ruling threw a wrench into the case, and many wondered if justice would ever truly be served. But the prosecution wasn't giving up. They knew that despite the setback, the evidence against Cooey was overwhelming. Investigators had uncovered blood-stained mattresses, DNA evidence, and a clear trail that led straight to the man who had stolen Jessica's life. There was no escaping the facts. John Cooey had abducted Jessica, violated her, and left her to die in a shallow grave. Still, the defense continued to put up a fight. They argued that Cooey had been mentally impaired, suggesting that he wasn't in full control of his actions. But the evidence spoke louder. The details of his actions, his plans, and the coldness with which he had executed them painted a picture of a man who knew exactly what he was doing. The prosecution's case was solid. Jessica's story was too powerful to ignore. As the trial dragged on, it became clear that the jury would have to make a choice. They could see the truth. They could hear the testimony from the investigators, the witnesses, the people who had known Jessica. They could feel the weight of her loss, and they knew that justice was the only way forward. Finally, after days of deliberation, the jury reached a verdict and declares Cooey guilty. John Cooey was convicted on all counts: kidnapping, sexual battery, and first-degree murder. The weight of the verdict settled heavily in the courtroom. The tears of Jessica's family were mixed with the relief that, at least for now, the man who had stolen her life would pay for his actions. But the story didn't end there. Cooey was sentenced to death, an outcome that many felt was the only just resolution for such an unspeakable crime. But the justice system has its own way of moving, and it soon became clear that Cooey's death sentence would never be carried out. For years, the legal battle continued as Cooey's defense team filed appeals, trying to delay his execution. The wheels of justice turned slowly, and each passing year seemed to drag on the pain for Jessica's family. Though he was condemned to die, his fate was drawn out, leaving a bitter taste in the mouths of those who had hoped for a quicker resolution. But even though his life was spared, the impact of the trial was undeniable. John Cooey would spend the rest of his life behind bars, but the damage he had caused would last far longer than any sentence. The trial had shown the world the brutality of his actions, and though the legal system could only do so much, it had offered a measure of justice. But for Jessica's family, it would never bring her back. No trial could ever heal the wound that Cooey had left in their hearts. As the dust settled from John Cooey's trial and conviction, the grief of Jessica Lunsford's death still hung heavy in the air. But something powerful began to emerge from that darkness, something that would carry Jessica's memory and shape the future of child safety in the United States. This gave rise to the Jessica's Law. Her death ignited a nationwide outcry for change. The tragedy of a 9-year-old girl being abducted by a man who should have never been free, a convicted sex offender living just yards away from her home, struck a chord with millions of people. It wasn't just a Florida problem. It was a national problem. It was a problem that could no longer be ignored. In Florida, lawmakers quickly moved to pass Jessica's Law, a piece of legislation that set mandatory minimum sentences for sex offenders, required GPS tracking for those convicted of sexual offenses against children, and created a tougher stance on parole for sex offenders. The impact of Jessica's law was profound. It wasn't just a change in Florida, it spread like wildfire. Within just a few years, 42 states had adopted some form of Jessica's law, and the ripple effect was felt across the country. The law became a symbol of hope for families, a promise that future generations of children would be better protected from the horrors Jessica had suffered. But for Mark Lunsford, Jessica's father, the fight wasn't over. Mark was a father who had lost everything: his precious daughter, his peace of mind, his sense of safety. But his pain became the driving force behind his relentless pursuit for justice. He wasn't going to sit back and let his daughter's death be forgotten. He wasn't going to let other families suffer in the same way he had. He refused to let Jessica's life be in vain. Mark didn't just stop at the passing of Jessica's law. He pushed for even tougher laws, speaking to legislators, appearing in the media, and advocating for stronger protections for children. He filed lawsuits, demanded accountability from the authorities who had failed to properly monitor cooey, and held public officials to task for their neglect. Mark's personal fight was also a battle for every child who could have been the next victim. He worked tirelessly to ensure that no other parent would have to face the same horrors that he had. His advocacy for stricter laws and improved safety measures for children became a beacon of hope for families everywhere. Through his efforts, Mark ensured that Jessica's legacy would live on, not just in the memories of those who knew her, but in the hearts of everyone fighting for a safer world. Though nothing could bring Jessica back, her legacy was undeniable. Through the courage of one father and the strength of a community, her death sparked a nationwide movement, a movement that would change the way sex offenders were treated and help protect future generations of children. Mark Lunsford's fight continues, and Jessica's memory remains alive in every law, every movement, and every child who is kept safer by the laws that were born from her tragic story. As we come to the end of Jessica Lunsford's story, it's clear that justice was served, but the damage caused by John Cooey's actions could never be undone. The Lunsford family's loss remains a heart-wrenching reminder of the urgent need to protect our children, not just from the dangers we know, but from the ones we fail to see. Jessica's death was a tragedy that shook a community, a state, and a nation. Her family will never be the same, and her absence is felt by everyone who knew her. Yet, in the wake of this pain, there was a shift, a collective realization that we can do better. We must do better. Jessica's legacy lives on, not just through the laws named after her, but in every step we take to keep our children safe. And while the fight continues, we must ask ourselves, how do we prevent tragedies like this from ever happening again? Are we doing enough to ensure our children are protected? Are we holding those responsible for their safety accountable? Take a moment to reflect on what we can do to make a difference. And if this story has moved you, if it has made you think about the safety of children everywhere, I urge you to subscribe to this channel. Share this story with others so that we can all stay vigilant, informed, and committed to ensuring that no other child falls victim to such a horror. Together, we can honor Jessica's memory and keep her legacy alive in every step we take toward a safer future.